Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. I'm Suzanne Sherman. I will be your host for the next hour here on the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Joining me today in our cyber studio is my very good friend, co-host, and Mr. Producer, Jeff Johnson. We'll be bringing him into the conversation today as well. Feels like we haven't done this in forever. I was away last week, and I want to thank also Jeff and Justin Spears for filling in Monday. Justin had some articles published by FEE in the 10th Amendment Center. They talked about the need to decentralize education and subsidiarity, some great concepts there that they covered. We're going to get Justin back on this week and follow up with the conversation we had, bringing in homeschooling and unschooling into the conversation. We ran out of time. By the way, today is Tuesday, June 26th, the year of our Lord 2019. If you're listening live on the YouTube chat, please weigh in, make your feelings and comments be known. We'll share them on the show. You can also reach me on my Facebook private chat there as well. Suzanne Sherman's The Wasatch Report radio shows, how you could follow me, facebook.com, Cerberus Radio Network. We have our radio page. CRN is our fan page. Again, we have a YouTube page. We'd ask that you subscribe. SoundCloud, if you can't listen live, download our shows. They're for free. Jeff, I think we have a few hundred up there now. We've also got some of our other shows, the Fundamentals of Federalism, Case in Point, where I discuss landmark Supreme Court cases and how they affect us today. Almost all of them are held in contravention to the intentions of our founders and ratifiers. So that's always interesting. We're going to be having a conversation about the pattern continuing today with the hailed outcome of the Blandensburg Cross controversy out in Maryland. We'll be getting into that. And also a little bit of federalism. The feds seem like they are considering practicing federalism when it comes to marijuana and law enforcement in states where it is legal. So we'll get into that as well as a few other things. Jeff, my friend, how are you today?
I'm doing all right. I unfortunately had to work 16 hours yesterday, so that's why there was no shows yesterday at all, because I was unavailable. Besides that, Greg is still slumming it in Paris, and I think you had things going on yesterday as well.
Well, yesterday I was actually available, but I knew you worked a double. The day before, I actually had to take my motor home down to get some plumbing repairs addressed. We've been trying to patch it up and be self-sufficient, but when my RV turned into a fountain on my last camping trip, we decided it was time to bring the pros in. Last week, I did go to this event. It's called Fire to Fire. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but there are essentially four main primitive survival gatherings. And we've talked about the different types of preparedness, survival, primitive, and otherwise. This is a primitive survival gathering. There are about four of the main ones out here in the Western United States. The first one they seem to kick the year off with is called Winter Count, and that is around, I think, in February in the Tucson area. There's another one called Between the Rivers. They had that one just before this event. That's in Washington. The one I went to was local. That was out here, not far away from me in Utah on the Duchesne River. And that was called Fire to Fire. It was one of the smaller of the gatherings. Really some great people. And then finally Rabbit Sticks out in Idaho in September. But Jeff, you met a lot of the folks that were out there. Dave Holliday, you met him when you came out here for PrepperCon. You got to meet that guy. He's just absolute legend in the primitive survival circles there. Also, a couple of the guests that we've had on our shows, my good friend Mikhail Makurioff, and he had come on our show to talk about his Emberlit stove, which is a portable stove that you can just build a fire on wherever you are, and it fits in a little pack. Also, Jason Staker, both of these guys, by the way, were on the Bushcraft Build-Off series, a Discovery Channel program that was filmed in my backyard. So it was good to meet some of the other cast and crew members from that show. They were out there as well. Also, they get some casting people out out there looking for some of the reality shows. So if that's a goal of yours, you kind of got to be seen out there. I don't think they're going to come knocking on the door of the girl that's camping out in the RV though. Jeff, what do you think?
I don't think so. But I met Mikhail at the
Mhm.
PrepperCon. But as a matter of fact, I bought one of his little fire starter sticks.
Yep.
So yeah, it was a great medium. And I know I met that holiday gentleman. What was
Yeah.
his first name?
Dave Holiday. He's
Dave
remarkable.
Holiday. Right. I know I met him there. Michael Hawk at that meadow. They were really, really nice people there.
Yeah, they were. They were. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with, I think it was Dave. There were so many people there. They have classes, they have really cool gatherings. It's just a tremendous sense of community. You go to these places and everybody just kind of sheds the wall. They expose their vulnerability and they really connect out in an environment like that. And it's very supportive and a lot of fun, great for the kids, great for the adults. I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed it. One of the conversations I had though was interesting because we talk about this on our show a lot about preparedness and how are you going to survive if the situation happens, and you can say, well, I'm not a primitive survivalist, I'll never need to be. Jeff, how many scenarios have we discussed on this show where we talked about the man with his daughter just going from one hotel, well, I guess from their home to a hotel, but they had to go on these remote roads. This was up in the Canada area, and he had a crash on the snowmobile, broke his leg, and now the daughter's traipsing through the woods full of wolves, and they had absolutely no equipment, just the clothes on their back and a little backpack because they were going to get there, of course, no problem. Well, one of the scenarios that one of these experts was sharing with me is the problem people have today is you have individuals, thanks to the machines like the snowmobiles or those side by sides that I go out hunting on, some of them have the tracks for when we're going through the snow, is people are getting out into areas. Once upon a time they would have to either hike out there or horseback, so you were limited by what you could accomplish and handle and cope with physically. These days, you can get out into these areas where you have no business being, and you don't bring the proper equipment with you because you think that this machinery is going to get you home safely. Well, as we know, you can crash these machines or they can have mechanical failures. And this is the problem. People are getting out into these areas, they don't have the skill set. And Jeff, I think you and I talked about this last hunting season. One of the elk hunters took his snowmobile off a ravine. He didn't have the stuff, nor did he have the beacons that I gave them. I said, send these out. They're these little beacons. They fit right in your car. You can have one in your pack for when you're camping. You're easy to find. Well, also what broke down was one of these side by sides, the ones on the tracks. They only had one with them. So my friend, the guide, was the only one in physical shape to get through the snow. He went through about 4 hours it took him. Meanwhile, two guys about in their 70s were sitting in the machine. I said, did they have any gear to close them in? Did they have anything to keep them warm or hot food or water? No, they had nothing. And sometimes I'm chastised because I go on these trips and I've got my survival bag. You don't need that. There's no room for that in the buggy. Oh, it's coming. It is coming. And if something like that happens to me, it's going to make it a lot more tolerable. So I thought it was interesting because, again, people don't think that you need primitive survival skills. And, Jeff, you mentioned Michael Hawk. I kind of consider Michael Hawk not a primitive survivalist. Could he survive? Yeah, but these are the folks that seem to have the equipment they need with them all the time. Primitive survival means you get caught out, you got nothing. You got to know how to make either a friction fire or you have a ferro rod like we both purchased from Mikhail. You have a shelter with you. Remember last fall, I was helping a friend of mine. He was using a tractor to make some roads up on some very remote property where we were here. And I thought I was lost. And I thought, okay, well, you know what? I'll be okay because I'm going to use my duct tape, my tarp, and then make an enclosure in this vehicle I'm in. I've got food, I've got water. I don't want to spend the night here, but if I have to, I'll be fine. So I just thought that was an interesting little aside there. And if anybody's interested in attending any of these, give me a call or send me a message, and I'm happy to give you some more information. But I have to say they're very welcoming. Like I said, it's a primitive survival gathering, and I was not the only one there with an RV. But Jeff, I tell you, it was primitive for me because I was rocking it without the hookups.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about at your house last year when we had the big shenanigans doing out there.
Oh, quick
He
interruption. When I say the hookups, I'm talking about electrical hookups.
oh, I'm glad you clarified that because everyone we named was a gentleman. So
Right.
I was thinking, it could get out of hand here.
Well, I
Anyway,
that word means something different to the young kids.
that's true. Anyway, talking of survivalist, primitive survivalists, you had at your house Eric Betcher, who was a guest on one of your shows,
Yeah.
and he most certainly is someone that can survive with practically nothing in the wilderness. He can get himself fire, and he has the ability and food and a number of different things that he is very knowledgeable on. And he has a book. So, folks, if you want to find it, I think it's on one of ours pages. I think you can find Eric Betcher.
I'll post it again. He was actually out here a month ago or so, and we were doing some filming for building a friction fire. He did a great job, and he was practicing. You want to practice these skills when it's uncomfortable. The winds were really high. It was a real pain to get that thing lit, but he got it done.
Yep. So I know that I've been in situations where when I lived in Colorado, elk season, you get out there and you're out in the wilderness and hunting, and I thought I was lost. I was able to get myself turned back around and figure out where I was and get out. But if I didn't, did I have the stuff with me? At that time, I was not as prepared as I am today.
Well, interesting. After I just share this one other quick story, we're going to move on to some of the other topics. But a conversation I was having with Dave Holliday, he was actually sharing a story with me where he got lost in a very remote area. And this was in the mountains around the Flagstaff, Arizona region. And he was walking. And then he came across a set of footprints and he said, those were mine. And he said, I've heard all the time how people when when they don't know where they're going will just naturally walk in a circle, because I never thought it was true, but lo and behold, I actually did it. And he said, I realized I was lost. And I said, well, what did you do? And I said, couldn't you just use the sun and directional, navigation that way? He said, no, the sky was it was gray all the way across. You could not tell one direction from another. And that sometimes happens. What do you do when you can't use the sun as a means to navigate? And he said, so what I did was, and this is really important. Jeff, a lot of people get in trouble because they panic when they're lost. And then they start moving. They move fast and they can actually get themselves from one area that's been searched and then leave it and then get back to another area and not be found because they're panicking and they're moving. So he said he just laid down on the ground for about 45 minutes to an hour. And he knew that the directions of the weather patterns and how they traveled through that area of Arizona. And he said, so I just watched, and after about 45 minutes to an hour, I could detect a pattern because I knew that the weather comes from the southwest. I think that was the direction, he said. And after he figured that out, he, made sure it was a consistent pattern. He found his way north and got out of where he was going. So it was just a reminder how important it is to not panic and sometimes be still. Again, your number one tool when you get out in an area like that is your mind.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
You just gotta. I mean, panic is the thing that just will. No matter what it is in life, if you panic, you're going to make mistakes. Whether it's in a survival situation, I was a firefighter. If you panic when you're in a fire, bad things happen. So you just got to slow down, start thinking, and usually you'll figure out. Like I said, that day I thought I was lost in the woods, and I was pretty much lost, but I stopped. I calmed myself down, and I figured out where I was, and so I looked for landmarks, and I found my way out.
Yeah. Hey, I want to change gears real quick now. Another form of wilderness I have here where I live is my expansive lawn. Every spring, I get inundated with dandelions. And I don't spray for them. I don't treat for them. I've actually done shows on how they can be very helpful. They're delicious. Yeah, you don't have that perfectly manicured lawn look, but they actually serve a very good purpose. They are frequently the first food for bees after a long, miserable winter. These are the first flowers that come out and bloom. And Salt Lake City, this is an article out of the Salt Lake Tribune. I usually call it the Salt Lake Spittoon. Commentary, get the government off my lawn. You're going to love this one, Jeff. This is a gal that was shocked when she opened her mail last summer to find a letter from Roy City. That's out here in Utah, Roy City, giving her notice to appear in court for a misdemeanor. This young lady, Jeff, was selling crack from her home. I'm just kidding. She had dandelions on her lawn. That act is prohibited by the municipal code. And as you and I were talking before the show, you were sharing how Mark Cressland's has the theory that if we have legislatures, this is the crap we come up with. When you have a legislator, they always get new ones coming in and they always put more and more onerous, burdensome laws on us. And this is just ridiculous because you can see how far they can take this. So she is supposed to appear in court for a misdemeanor. She quickly paid to have the area cut and sprayed. But as we know, when you cut dandelions, I know with me, Jeff, I cut them. Those little stalks are sticking up the next day. They are more powerful than a John Deere. I'm also not going to poison them because I have a well here. I don't want to poison my drinking water. I also don't want my chickens eating something that's been sprayed. But anyway, so she's facing a charge that could land her in jail. And this is not uncommon. They're saying the first altercation she had with code enforcement presents two important questions. First, aside from the city, did anyone actually mind the dandelions? And we know this all the time. They'll say somebody complained. Did they present a harm to the health and safety of nearby residents? Well, of course not. In fact, Jeff, what I had said earlier, they actually are beneficial. We're going to get the pollinators, the bees, they get this food, and they're only up for about a month or two. You mow your lawn a couple times and they're gone. Numerous municipal ordinances across the state here in Utah have criminal penalties for violating minor property offenses. They put people in similar situations to this lady. And they say here in the article that this needs to change. Yes, absolutely. It's not the government's job to create and use their property as they see fit when prohibited action isn't following or restricting people's ability to use their property as they see fit, when this prohibited action isn't actually harming anyone. This reminds me of the story out in Florida where a couple had to absolutely dig up and destroy a vegetable garden that they'd had for about 17 years. Ultimately, the state came down with the state law, again, more laws. But this was a good one, apparently, that said that the municipalities can't have these types of prohibitions. I bet you this, though, this couple was never provided with restitution for having to destroy this garden that they'd had for so long. So this story, the article continues, demonstrates that we have real world consequences of a law passed with ostensibly good intentions. I can't give them credit for that. What do you mean good intentions? Neighborhood uniformity, lawns that all looks pristine. I don't think, to me, that's a good intention. When you desire to control how somebody lives and what kind of weeds or flowers or vegetables grow in their front yard or lawn, there is no way to call that a good intention. That is a huge stretch. So her government, alongside many others here in Utah, dictates outward beautification standards for one's home. Should they also dictate what color we paint our houses? Well, you get that when you move into a place with a homeowners association. What about the height of rose bushes, types of vegetables? So standards like this, the article says, should be left to the individual or at best, a neighborhood association. I don't want that either. Lawn violations aren't the only government overreach Utahns face on the residential property. People in many cities are prohibited from renting their home out on short-term basis to earn extra income. You know, Jeff, the hotel industries were behind that one. Even when it poses no threat of harm or nuisance to neighbors, they restrict the amount of type of animals one may keep in their home. I talked about that when I lived in California. I had 2 acres in an agriculturally zoned area. If I was to have more than 2 dogs, I need to file for a permit application for a kennel license, and my neighbors had to sign off of it and then pay a $100 fee, renewable annually, of course. So again, this is ridiculous, but this is the reason why I live in the city or in the mountains, and I would never live within a city limits like that. So I just thought that was a little bit ridiculous. It is on my Facebook page. You can see that. Any comments on that one, Jeff?
No, I think if you go to the dog story, we can tie them both together, and I'll make my comments then.
Okay, let me see if I can find this one.
If
This,
you want to do the dog story, if you don't want to do the dog story, that's fine.
no,
And I'll just make my comments.
I just have to find it here now. Here we go. This is from Rhode Island. And last week, you and I were talking about animal cruelty laws. And what I had said on our last discussion of this is we all know there are extreme examples of animal cruelty, which simply shouldn't be tolerated in civilized society. That being said, we take these extreme examples and use them to create and justify greater laws of animal cruelty, and it bleeds over to animal neglect. And we end up from starting with the extreme going to the ridiculous of laws. And in your state, Jeff, you have to actually have now there are zoning or code requirements for dog houses. Have you gotten out and gotten your drywall and your plumbing and your electric for your dog's house?
I don't think that passed yet, but that was being discussed in Harrisburg, and I don't know if it finally died in Harrisburg, but no, I didn't. And I planned on ignoring that law if I ever built a doghouse.
I mean, this is crazy. So, and I saw this before, some of us, like I lived in California and I had a horse in my backyard. And as he got older, it was impossible to keep weight on him. It was very difficult. And then the problem is somebody passes by who may be well-intentioned or not, and they will accuse you of neglecting your animal because it is old and infirm and underweight. There was nothing I could do. I spent a fortune trying to keep weight on this horse before he finally passed away. And but anyway, and I'll share another story with you. There was a gal, I was friends with her out there, and she saw a bull on private property in a pasture. And in her mind, this bull might have been unwell because he hadn't gotten up. In her mind, maybe he had gotten up and moved around. And he just liked the spot. He had been in the same spot for days. So I picked some grass and I went through the fence. She crossed a barbed wire fence to go check on a bull. Not pit bull, not a little, miniature bulldog, a bull, a real live 1,200 plus pound bull. She goes to check on it. Said bull all of a sudden is quite healthy and spry and decides to chase her through the field. What does she do? She falls and severely breaks her leg. The bull finally catches up to her, sniffs her, and walks away. But now she's got a broken leg, and guess what? Landowner gets sued by the trespasser. This is how crazy these laws get when you assume that taking care of your animals or that the care of other people's animals is all of a sudden your responsibility. Now a landowner whose animal was perfectly fine had to face a lawsuit for that. But let me get to that Rhode Island case. They're talking about confiscating dogs for minor offenses. This is a bill that's proposed that would force dog owners to forfeit their dogs if convicted of even minor animal-related offenses. It's been assigned to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and there are numbers here you can call if this affects you. We'll post it on our news page. People convicted under this law are going to be forced to register, and it would appear in a registry for 15 years and would be prohibited. The people would be prohibited from owning any animals for 15 years. This is HB 5113, lumps all sorts of offenses from the truly awful that we mentioned are the justification for many of these animal cruelty laws to completely minor. I don't know, code violation for your dog's house. Maybe the water isn't close enough by. Maybe maybe you went away and somebody that you had hired, like that guy who hired somebody to mow his lawn, something happened and they find your dog's out of water for an hour or two. That's a minor violation, is it not? So you're forced to register. You won't be allowed to purchase another animal for 15 years. The registry would also include the addresses of violators, which would expose kennels, dog owners, and their family members to targeting by animal rights extremists. Anyone failing to register would face up to $1,000 fine year of jail time, or both. If you refuse to pay that fine or refuse to surrender your animal, or you get another one, you refuse to surrender, Jeff, what do you think can happen?
Well, they'll send guys with guns.
Right. If you have dandelions on your lawn, you don't mow them. They try to, you don't pay those fees. That guy, remember, his lawn was 10 inches too high because he went out of state. His mom passed away. The person that he hired to take care of his lawn, he passed away, and he's losing his home over $30,000 in fine. This is government run amok. So you think Washington, D.C. is insane? It's at every single level. You know, we had a show a few weeks ago about the sociopaths going to Washington. I think that these positions of power attract the people that are least likely to be trusted with it. And I don't care if it's at your municipal level, your local homeowners association, or Washington, D.C. What we need to do is instill in the mindset of people, what is the proper role in government and where is it where they really need to butt out? Clearly, nobody supports animal cruelty or neglect, but to put somebody on a register where you're essentially doxed, where these animal rights nutcases can find your home, is a bit extreme.
Yeah. Well, here's what we talked about before the show, and I've really come to agree with, like I said, with Mark Kreslin's on this. I've really gotten to the point where I'm a real minarchist or maybe a volunteerist. I'm not quite sure where I fall in that continuum, but one thing I do know, that I oppose any governmental system that includes legislators. I do not ever want to see another legislator ever in a governmental system that I'm under, because you get stupid stuff like this. Dandelion laws, where someone could lose their house, or you don't mow your lawn, you're going to lose your house over not mowing your lawn while you're at your a relative's funeral. I mean, there's absolute ridiculousness of this whole situation. I am convinced that, number one, decentralization. Number two, some sort of absolute minimal government that you could possibly have, and probably have laws passed by some sort of public referendum that needs an absolute supermajority of support, maybe like 90% support to pass a law. So you wouldn't get 90% of the people to vote for this stupid stuff.
Yeah, we
that
want
you're
to
seeing here.
make it harder to create new laws. And then also, I want to refer people, if you go to my website, SuzanneCSherman.com, we also have a social media bar there. Our SoundCloud and YouTube buttons are there, and you can hear any of our shows just by going to my website. You can also listen to my, you can also read my articles and my blog. But I'm bringing that up because I have on there, through an Amazon affiliate link, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, that was written in the 1850s as a refutation to the Communist Manifesto. And one of the conversations I was having again this past week when I was away, we were talking about the public school, or the school system in general. Everybody's heard about the Communist Manifesto, but how many school-age kids or even adults have ever heard, let alone read, The Law? So I encourage you. It's just about, I think it's about $7. You can pick it up. And if you do that, by the way, it will help us out. We're trying to get some money for some better equipment. A little bit of federalism, and then I'm going to get into the Supreme Court. But here's an article that says Congress is voting to block the feds from enforcing marijuana laws in the states where it is legal. Well, I wrote an article called Parchment and Plants, What Prohibition Can Teach Us About the Drug War, that was published by the 10th Amendment Center. By the way, happy 13th birthday to the 10th Amendment Center. That glorious day was yesterday. So big shout out to Michael Bolden, Mike Meharry, for all the good work they do there. And I'm proud to be a regular contributor to that organization. I encourage everybody to follow them and also support them financially. This article here says the House of Representatives has approved a far-reaching measure to prevent the DOJ from interfering with state marijuana laws, including those allowing recreational use, cultivation, and sales. What I'd like to say is the state always had this power. It's called nullification. In fact, they exercised nullification when they legalized marijuana for use, medical or otherwise, and it ignored federal laws. And in fact, President Obama had told the DOJ not to enforce federal marijuana laws, to which the constitutionalist, the originalist Ted Cruz chided Obama for not enforcing unconstitutional laws. But the states have that power on their own as well. So this amendment that they're talking about, this law, is going to shield cannabis laws also in Washington, D.C. and U.S. territories. And this is the inclusion of adult use programs, represents a significant expansion in existing polity that protects only local medical cannabis laws from federal intervention. Again, we don't need this. Federal marijuana laws are all unconstitutional. They are null and void without legal effect. The only problem is the states don't seem to recognize their obligation to ignore, nullify unconstitutional and federal overreach. We'll put that article up there. That was out of Forbes magazine. So also, let's see. I think what I want to do is discuss the Blandensburg Cross. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about, Jeff, on that case first?
Now, other than just mention again, so these states have legalized the use of a plant, but they're not going to protect these same people from the federal government in relations to gun laws. So, if they're going to nullify it on the one end, they need to nullify the other. They just need to protect the people of their state. But again, we have all kinds of examples where they don't do that. And because of money, they're on the take, and they're involved in the total graft that this illegal, immoral general government is. So that's all I had on that, really.
Well, when I went to the Fox News page today, once again, there's another headline talking about Supreme Court conservatives move to overturn precedents, raises question of Roe v. Wade, which we know is the holy grail of the leftist agenda. And it just shows, I'm not going to get into that article, but it just shows how much we wait for what the Supreme Court says on anything, pretty much with bated breath. And we talked about this case, and I'm going to get into right now, before on this show. And I had said before, this is a local issue. It's not a federal issue. Well, out of NPR, and again, everybody's talking about it, but I have an article here from NPR. The Supreme Court says, according to the headline, Cross can stand on public land in separation of church and state case. Now, our friend Kevin Gutzman wrote an amicus brief. He participated in the drafting of an amicus brief that went before the Supreme Court advocating that the cross can stay. And we had a big debate on that page. It was me and I think one lawyer from Yale and another from Harvard. So there were some pretty heavy hitters out there. And here I am, the girl in the mountains arguing with these guys. And I'm going to state my case here because I just decided I don't like to just sit around and argue on Facebook. I can state my case. I have an article I'm drafting about this, and we will be publishing it. But here, essentially, they said the U.S. court ruled on Thursday that this World War I memorial cross can stay on public land at a Maryland intersection. Now, here's what they say, public land. My first question is, which public land? Are we talking about local public land? Or are we talking about federal public land? Differentiating between, for instance, Heller and McDonald, the gun laws in Heller were from Washington, D.C. So that implicated, of course, congressional laws because Congress dubiously delegated power to legislate D.C. in D.C.'s local government. So that had Second Amendment implications, which Scalia got wrong. Then we have McDonald, and they're talking now about gun laws, but we're talking about state gun laws. So we're talking now about an issue called incorporation. And you have to ask yourself, was the Bill of Rights ever intended to apply to the states? And that was my problem with the amicus briefing saying that the cross should stand. It's not a federal issue. We're going to get into how it became one. And it did so surreptitiously and unconstitutionally. I will tell you why. So public land. Where was this public land? It was Maryland's land. The cross has become a prominent community landmark, they say here in the article, and its removal or radical alteration at this date would be seen by many not as a neutral act, but as a manifestation of a hostility towards religion that has no place in our Establishment Clause traditions, wrote Supreme Court Justice, the Black Robe Messiah, Justice Sam Alito, who penned the majority opinion for the court. There was one justice that got it right, and that was Thomas, who said that the Bill of Rights was not to apply to the states. One guy got it right. Alito added that contrary to the challenger's intimation, he said there's no evidence of discriminatory intent in the selection of the design of the memorial or the decision of the Maryland Commission to maintain it. Maryland Commission. What does the First Amendment say? Congress shall make no law affecting an establishment of religion. Congress and Maryland, two different entities. Going back to the article, the religion clause of the Constitution aims to foster a society in which people of all beliefs can live together harmoniously, and the presence of the Blandensburg Cross on the land where it has stood for so many years is fully consistent with that aim. What a bunch of horse crap. Seriously, Jeff, is this the aim of the religion clause of the Constitution, to ensure that everybody can live together harmoniously? No, it is to absolutely reiterate the fact that Congress was never empowered to regulate speech, assembly, redress for grievances, establishment, free exercise of religion, the press at all. They were never delegated that power by the states under Article 1, Section 8. The Bill of Rights is a reaffirmation of the fact that that power was never delegated. Applies to the Second Amendment as well. So the decision here was 7-2. It had multiple parts, and I do have the window open. I'm perusing through this opinion, and as I do, I realize how much of it is absolutely irrelevant. Just like Scalia's 63-page explanation of what the Second Amendment protected, and he still got it wrong. This was the same thing. They wax eloquent and in detail describe the Establishment Clause and whether or not this cross violated it, based on what we call the Lemon Test, another case over which they had no authority, but they decide to legislate from the bench. So essentially what they're saying, we call it purpose, effect, and entanglement. So was the purpose of this cross to effect an establishment of religion? No. Was this an establishment of religion? They said no on this case as well. And then, was there excessive government entanglement? Well, other than the taxpayers paying for this and funding it, that was about all they had. So they answered these questions in the negative. It was long, it was tedious to read, and again, not applicable. The decision was 7-2. It had multiple parts, and not all of the 7 agreed on every aspect. The decision reverses a lower court ruling that said the memorial is unconstitutional because it is on public land and maintained at taxpayer expense. The High Court's ruling is a major victory for religious groups, and the American Legion, which warned that if this cross had to be removed, so too would other crosses that serve as war memorials. And what Dr. Gutzman had said in the discussion we were having is, look, if Ruth Ginsburg had her way, every single cross would be removed from Arlington. And this is the problem. I also discussed this with my friend and co-author of a few articles we've written, Carl Jones. He said, because of the left's antics and the American Humanist Association, which brought forth this lawsuit, they're pushing us. We have to act defensively and now run to the federal courts and seek redress on this. So what happened was, I think it was the humanists had put this, so people that wanted the cross removed ran to federal court. And this is how we get into federal court. They allege a constitutional question. Supreme Court jurisdiction cases and controversies arising under the Constitution will be heard in federal court and ultimately the Supreme Court. Well, this is what they said. When the plaintiffs filed in federal court, what, Kevin said, are we supposed to do? Just default and let this come down and set that precedent? That's the problem with running to the federal judiciary. Again, like Carl said, we're on the defense here. Here's the problem. When you celebrate this as a victory, I guess this is the difference between being an idealist, which I've been accused of being, and being a pragmatist. Kevin's approach was very pragmatic. Well, here we have this risk that all these crosses are going to have to come down, or we're going to have to stand firm and let some reason come in and say this is a completely ridiculous demand that this be taken down because taxpayers are paying for it. So what happens is you just allege a constitutional question and run to federal court, and there you are. So my final question to the people that were justifying this and hailing this as a victory, ultimately it's a victory, just like the cake baker in Colorado. He personally won his case, but ultimately federalism loses. And when we have top-down decisions from 9 governing the actions of over 320 million people, federalism, republicanism ultimately loses. Our freedoms and liberty will also be lost as well. That's not representative form of government. So again, these were issues that were local that are all called constitutional questions. And here was my question to them, and it was never answered. So according to this logic, an individual in California can go to court claiming a Second Amendment violation over California's draconian gun laws, and all of a sudden now the Supreme Court has authority over California's gun laws, and they have ruled on it time and time again. But is
The
that
most
what?
recent one, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, the most recent one was that magazine ban. The courts ruled that the federal courts ruled that they couldn't ban those 30 round magazines and such. And so they're selling them in California right now.
And here's what happens when you run to the federal judiciary. I said, this is incorporation doctrine. When you run to the federal judiciary, you are rolling the dice. What if this had gone the other way and they said the cross had to come down? Is Maryland now going to ignore, nullify, not follow through with this? So Alito said that the cross had essentially become secular. Again, it's not an issue. What the court should have said was, this is a local issue. But when has the Supreme Court or the general government in recent times or ever said, you know what, we weren't intended to have this kind of power. We're just going to back away from this and let the states handle this themselves. Doesn't happen. It just,
Suzanne, I'm
yeah.
sorry. I need to jump in because
Yeah.
I don't want anyone out there to think that we're anti-high cap magazines by my statements just a moment ago. All right. I want to nip that in the bud. Just like you did earlier.
Well, again, it's just a matter of what is the proper role of the government and what are we supposed to be, we have to, if we have one top-down regulation coming from Washington, D.C., we're going to end up with gun laws across this continental landmass like California's and not like, say, Utah, Wyoming, Texas, or Arizona. So again, going back to this case here, the high court's ruling is a major victory for religious groups, and that's how I got into that conversation. This is a major victory for religious groups. No, it isn't. They warned if the cross had to be removed, so too would the others that serve as war memorials. Again, we're on the defensive when we have to fight this way. I still think that this is a result of everybody just deferring to the Supreme Court to determine policy matters that were intended to always be left to the states, reiterated by the 10th Amendment. So,
Suzanne,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm going to go to the document so we can just spell with this right now. And the First Amendment starts off, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it goes from there, but that's the clause. And I don't know how this I didn't realize that Maryland was Congress now.
Yeah, exactly. So here's what Ginsburg says in her dissent. She noted it's clear what the purpose and meaning of the cross was from the start. It was religious. Americans knew what it meant then and know what it means now. So decades ago, she writes, the court recognized that the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution demands governmental neutrality among religious faiths. Now, it really just means that they can't establish their own national, pardon my French, church. But this is exactly what Scalia did when he defined what the Second Amendment means. All he had to say was the Second Amendment means that the general government may not regulate firearms. Period. Washington, D.C.'s draconian laws essentially act as a ban upon gun ownership. Therefore, we're going to strike it down as unconstitutional. Case closed. No, he didn't do that. Just like they're doing here, it goes into an examination of what the Second Amendment really means. And the genius comes up with the notion that the Second Amendment applies to handguns unconnected with service in the militia. And everybody's cheering this on as a major victory for gun rights. And it is absolutely not, because then when you allow them the power to define what these pre-existing rights are, they're going to say these rights are subject to regulation. If they properly understood the intention of the Bill of Rights, they would know that is a prohibition flat out of the general government regulating these areas that are enumerated altogether.
Suzanne,
Yeah.
I have a nice crisp $5 bill in my wallet, and I will give to the first caller that can show me in the Constitution where religion is banned from government. I'm serious. Show me in the Constitution where religion is banned from government. That is, the government is protected from religion, where you're protected from religion.
Well,
anywhere.
also,
I got $5.
At the time that the Constitution, the Bill of Rights were ratified, 3 states still had official state churches at the same time. The first Congress, and James Madison wanted the Bill of Rights applicable to the states, and that was denied. In fact, in my article, McDonald was an originalism failure, I go into that in tremendous detail. Maybe we'll bring that up, but I posted that article again. It goes into the whole history of incorporation and how it's just been an absolute disaster and direct contravention to all principles of federalism. So again, now rather than describing or analyzing what the actual intention of the Constitution as ratified and the Establishment Clause as ratified, who was the target of that? The general government. They go into this entire analysis of what the cross meant at the time and who put it up and was it a symbol of the Christian. It doesn't matter. All of that is irrelevant. And again, they mention here there are possible landmines for future cases. Mises, actually, I'm going to skip over to their article really quick. This came out on the 21st, the Supreme Court's dubious wall of separation between church and state. What they say here, we'll post this one up so you can see it as well, is by saying that because this was erected, I think in 1925, in 1918, citizens of Maryland in this town decided to erect a World War I monument for those from the town who had perished in the war. And now we have the federal government deciding whether or not that is allowed to state. So what they did was they based it on the fact that this cross was old. But here's the problem. Now, is this foreclosing the possibility of new such monuments being built? By the way, we have brand new gay pride flags hanging all up and down Main Street in Heber City out here in Utah. Well, they're not paid for by taxpayers. They're on public property, but you don't see any controversy. Some people are complaining, but you know what? It's staying up there. What if we wanted to have a nativity scene on the park? Yeah.
Suzanne, every day they're creating new crosses in Arlington National Cemetery. And they want to create more new crosses by going to war in Iran. So are they going to be protected, or are they going to have to do something about all those crosses over those dead soldiers? I mean, I'm sorry. I'm not anti-veteran here. And that last statement, I'm sorry, might have been crude, but it's just that I'm angry about this whole ridiculous nature of this government.
Well, here's what they say here. And I mentioned this also. Justice Hugo Black, and this is what they discuss in the Mises Institute article, beg your pardon. And I've said this before, Hugo Black invented the separation of church and state. Now, he was a Klansman, by the way, and these cases came up when it came to, I think, vouchers for Catholic schools. So his history as a Klansman was partly to blame for this whole misinterpretation of a letter from Thomas Jefferson to some Dansbury Baptists about a wall of separation. The wall must be kept high and impregnable, according to Justice Hugo Black, the Klansman, by the way. We could not approve the slightest breach. Justice Wiley Rutledge went further, writing that a complete and permanent separation of the spheres of religious activity and civil authority was required. This took a restriction preventing the federal imposition of a religion on non-believers and transformed it to a virtual denial of virtually any role for religion in public life. Now, the new religion we have here is gay pride. And do I see these flags all up and down Heber when I drive through? Yeah. Am I running to federal court? No, I disagree with it. I find not the fact that the flag is there offensive. What I find offensive is a blatant hypocrisy. So, but again, it's not an issue for the federal government in which to intervene. But the court essentially based its opinion on the fact that this monument had been erected some time ago at 1925. And here's what the author of the Mises article says. If the court was to pick 1947 as a debate for which a monument now challengeable in order to enforce a separation of church and state would carry a strong presumption of constitutionality. There's a presumption of constitutionality just because it's been up for a long time. What's not constitutional is the courts intervening, but they don't seem to care about that. So again, it would take seriously former Chief Justice William Rehnquist's view that the wall is a metaphor based on bad history, and he's correct, which is proved useless as a guide to judging. It should be frankly and explicitly abandoned. Here's the problem now. So as I mentioned earlier, there are areas of law and regulation from which the federal government was explicitly prescribed from interfering in. What Congress cannot do, meaning legislate firearms laws, but they do anyway. So let's assume that Congress is minding its manners and staying out of certain area. Somebody doesn't like what's going on. All they have to do is allege a constitutional question, a violation of the Constitution, run to federal court, and ultimately the Supreme Court will rule on a matter, I should say, from which the general government was prohibited from regulating. And then they will regulate from the bench. I mentioned the Lemon test. So they come up with this in-depth analysis of when a local monument will violate the Establishment Clause, when it's allowed, what's allowed, what was the intent, all this other stuff that has nothing to do with the fact that they are prohibited from getting involved in the first place. Again, I refer to Scalia's interpretation of the Second Amendment. What kind of guns are protected? Well, none of them. None of them are any of your business. And he comes to the conclusion handguns are protected from the First Amendment in there. It's an individual right, and it is not dependent on being in the militia. Well, no, what you've done now, just like they did in this case here, is leave a door open for other means of interference. So what do we have now with regards to the firearms? Well, we talk about AR bans, bump stock bans, and all that, because guess what? The only thing protected is the handgun. Now is the only monument, does it have to be over 100 years old or almost 100 years old to be protected? This is a matter for the local residents of this community to solve. Ultimately, what does the state of Maryland's Constitution say? That is the Constitution that matters. When people say there's a constitutional question, they assume there's only one. States have their own constitution. We also have this thing called the 10th Amendment. Matters that were never prohibited to the states or delegated to the general government, they remain with the states. Excuse me. Again, I explain all this in my article about the McDonald case. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Jeff?
Not at this time. Keep going. You're doing, or did you need me? Sure. I saw you mute your mic also. I thought maybe you needed me to say something right there.
Oh, I just had to cough for a moment here. Let me find that article again where I get into, I think it was that was McDonald.
Yeah. Well, really what it comes down to is it's very clear, if you read the preamble, that there are further declaratory and restrictive clauses against the general government. And if you read the First Amendment, they start off, and I think this was intentional, they put Congress shall make no law. And so all 10 Bill of Rights went together There was, I think, 11 or 12 that, and only 10 were ratified. But it started off on purpose with this Congress shall make no law. And I believe that's intentional. I think the framers were intent on making sure that these, and who had all the power. I discussed this with Justin on Monday. Who had all the power? Went all to Congress, and the president and the courts had almost no power. So they did it on purpose. They wanted to make sure that they knew where they were limited. So I hope that helped you with your cough.
It really does. And as I mentioned, again, I'm going to you can find this on my website again, SuzanneCSherman.com, how McDonald was an originalism failure. And again, how did we come up with this incorporation of the Bill of Rights against the states? We know as late as 1833, nationalist John Marshall said in a case called Barron versus Baltimore, he had to admit that the first 10 amendments, and I'll quote him, contain no expression indicating an intention to apply them to the state governments, and this court cannot so apply them. So in 1925, remember, how is it possible to modify the Constitution? There was a way to do it, and it's described in Article 5. Congress can either propose an amendment or the states can of their own volition. If you get enough of them doing so, it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify. What we see now, again, with the federal judiciary is every time we have the Supreme Court convene, we have a de facto convention of the states, only nobody's inviting the states. So we've got 9 politically connected lawyers saying what the law of the land is. Again, this is not representative form of government. So there was a case in 1925. Now, this is, again, constitutional convention where we're going to decide, the Supreme Court's going to decide to incorporate the Bill of Rights against the states. And I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to wrap up with this. And we're going to talk about the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary more this week as well. So it was a case called Gitlow versus New York. The Supreme Court found the authority to apply the Bill of Rights against the states in the 14th Amendment. And this is what we're taught in school. We're taught about the 3 branches of government, the checks and balances. And then we have the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, police powers of the states. Well, what does that do? That leaves you with the impression that they can have their own police forces to solve crime and prevent crime and so on and so forth. What they leave out of the checks and balances is the states. The states were considered to be the ultimate vanguard of our liberty and keeping the general government in check. We know that the 3 branches in our little triangle, Articles 1, 2, 3, those branches have failed miserably to restrain their own power. And why wouldn't they? Why in the world would they want to constrain themselves? So again, the interpretation by the court with regards to Gitlow and incorporation is very unhistorical. The 39th Congress proposed this amendment. They never discussed incorporation. No premise has been adhered to in the preceding years. But by 1925, when the progressive era was in full swing, the Supreme Court was on its way towards inflicting a complete rewrite of the Constitution of the United States Constitution on the American people, diminishing the separation of powers. So I get into that more on the article that I'm writing as well as in the McDonald case. But this is the problem here. We have this deference to the Supreme Court. And like I said on my debate here, this case was not a victory for religious freedom. It was a disaster for the ultimate vanguard of our freedom, which is federalism. Assuming this is not on federal land, and it is not, I did the research, it is run by a state organization. It's owned by 2 counties. The incorporation doctrine governs this case all the way. So again, this is a case where the Supreme Court have weighed in on a local matter that will have national, pardon my French, jurisdiction. Again, Kevin had said the court shouldn't have ordered that it be taken down. We argued that it shouldn't, and it didn't. Justice Thomas, as is his custom in establishment cause cases, took his position. Apparently, the majority sounded like the brief, but here's the problem. There's no authority for them to rule again on a local issue. I know I'm repeating myself, but this is really important. People need to understand this. So we're about out of time. I believe, Jeff, we're doing a show tomorrow as well.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, everybody, we'll be back. We're going to be covering more of these Supreme Court cases that are coming our way, and I'll find some other fun stuff for you as well. On behalf of those of us at Cerberus Radio Network, I'm Suzanne Sherman. Want to thank you for listening. Have a great day.